The cage sat in the middle of Redemption Creek's main street like a bad dream that refused to fade with morning light. Iron bars. 6 feet wide. 6 feet tall. Bolted to a flatbed wagon that hadn't moved in 11 days. Inside it, a man. He didn't pace. He didn't beg. He didn't even look at the crowds that gathered every afternoon to throw rocks, rotten fruit, and words sharp enough to draw blood. He just sat there in the dirt and the heat with his back against the bars and his eyes fixed on something nobody else could see. Something far away. Something that maybe didn't exist anymore. They called him the Pale Rider. His real name was Cold Dantry. And according to every bounty notice nailed to every post between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River, he was the most dangerous man alive. 3 marshals dead. 2 bank jobs. 1 massacre at a cattle ranch outside of Laredo that left 7 men in the ground and a barn burned to black timber. That was what the posters said. That was what people believed. Nobody got within 10 feet of that cage voluntarily. Not the children who threw stones. Not the drunks who came to taunt him after sundown. Not even Sheriff Harlan Pruitt, who had a habit of keeping no less than 2 deputies between himself and those iron bars at all times. But on the morning of the 12th day, a woman walked straight up to that cage. She didn't carry a weapon. She didn't walk fast or slow. She walked the way a person walks when they've already decided something that terrified them, and the deciding was the hardest part, and now the doing was just what came next. She stopped close enough to touch the bars. Cold Dantry looked up at her for the first time in 11 days. And she said, clearly enough for the whole frozen street to hear, "I need you to marry me." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Redemption Creek had ever heard. What happened next would tear that town apart, and before it was over, nothing would be the same. Not the town. Not Cold Dantry. And certainly not her. Her name was Ada Voss. And her reason for walking up to that cage was either the bravest thing anyone had ever done in Redemption Creek, or the most desperate. Maybe it was both. Ada Voss had not always been the kind of woman who made scenes in the middle of a street. She had been, for most of her 20 years, quiet in the way that people are quiet when they've learned early that being heard only brings trouble. She grew up on a small ranch 3 miles east of Redemption Creek, where her father, Thomas Voss, raised cattle and opinions in roughly equal measure. And where her mother had died of fever before Ada was old enough to remember her face clearly. She remembered the smell, though. Lavender and wood smoke. She had chased that smell her whole life and never quite caught it. The ranch was called the Double V. It wasn't much to look at, a main house with a sagging porch, a bunkhouse that leaked when it rained, and about 400 acres of scrubland that produced grass if you prayed hard enough and cursed the drought respectfully. But it was theirs. Thomas Voss had broken that land with his own hands and his own sweat, and he had a deed to prove it. And he kept that deed in a tin box under the floorboard beneath his bed like it was the most sacred thing in the world. He wasn't wrong. In the West, land was the difference between a life and a slow death. And somebody wanted that life. His name was Elton Marsh, and he was the kind of man who had never needed to be loud because the men around him were loud enough. He wore clean suits and clean boots and kept his gray hair combed back neat as a church deacon's. He owned the Redemption Creek Bank, the lumber mill, and enough of the local government to make the distinction between private interest and public law more or less decorative. For 2 years, Marsh had been buying up land along the creek. Legally, mostly. When that didn't work, through other methods entirely. Thomas Voss had refused to sell 3 times. The 4th time Marsh asked, he didn't ask. He sent 2 men out to the Double V in the middle of the night, and by morning there was a fire, and by the time anyone from town rode out to check, Thomas Voss was dead, and the deed was missing from its tin box under the floorboard. Ada had not been home that night. She had been in town, sitting with old Eleanor Hatch, who was ill and had no family. That small mercy, or maybe it was something else, something with darker intentions behind it, had kept Ada alive. She came home to smoke and silence, and the smell of something that wasn't lavender and wasn't wood smoke. She buried her father herself. 3 days later, Elton Marsh's lawyer appeared at her door with papers. The ranch had been purchased, the papers said. Paid in full. Here was the deed, signed by Thomas Voss himself. The signature looked almost right. Almost. Ada went to Sheriff Harlan Pruitt. He looked at the papers, looked at his boots, and told her these things were complicated and he wasn't in any position to call a respected man like Elton Marsh a forger without more evidence. She went to the circuit judge, who was passing through town. He told her civil property disputes were outside his jurisdiction on this particular visit and suggested she hire a lawyer. The only lawyer in Redemption Creek was on Elton Marsh's payroll. So Ada Voss spent the next 3 weeks sleeping in her wagon, which she had parked on the edge of town because she had nowhere else to go, and she was not finished yet. She had her father's horse, a rifle, $30, and the kind of anger that burns cold and quiet and doesn't go out. And then Cole Dantry arrived in a cage. She heard the stories like everyone else. The dead marshals. Laredo. The bounty on his head. But she also heard something else, something that Sheriff Pruitt let slip one evening when he'd had too much whiskey at the saloon and forgot to be careful. He said, "Dantry knows things about Marsh that'd make your hair go white." Ada went still when she heard that. She sat in the corner of that saloon and turned those words over and over like a coin with something written on both sides. Cole Dantry knew something about Elton Marsh. Something dangerous enough that Marsh had been the one who tipped the bounty hunters to Dantry's location. Something that Pruitt, 3 whiskeys deep and feeling guilty for reasons he couldn't quite name, thought was worth knowing. Ada Voss was not a woman who waited for permission. She had stopped believing in permission the night she came home to smoke and silence. The next morning she woke before dawn, combed her hair, put on the best dress she had left, dark blue, worn at the elbows, and walked to the cage in the middle of Redemption Creek's main street. The crowd that gathered was not there yet. The sun was barely up. There was just the light and the dust, and the man inside the bars with his knees drawn up and his eyes somewhere else. She stopped at the edge of the 10-foot gap nobody crossed voluntarily. Then she crossed it. And when she got close enough to see the lines in his face, not age, not quite, but something harder than age, something carved by specific events, she said the words she had practiced all night. She said, "I need you to marry me." Cole Dantry looked at her for a long time. His eyes were gray. Not gentle gray. Not storm gray. The gray of the sky in the hour before a storm, when the air goes very still and the animals all go quiet and the world holds its breath. He said, "Why?" And that single word, quiet as it was, told Ada something important. It told her he was listening. It told her he hadn't said no. Cole Dantry had been in worse places than this cage. He had been in a flooded mine shaft outside of Nevada City for 6 hours once, water rising to his chest, listening to the mountain groan above him and deciding whether or not to pray. He decided against it, not because he didn't believe in God, but because he figured if God was paying attention at all, no amount of praying was going to settle the account between them. He had been in a Confederate prison for 14 months during the war, a place so far below misery that the word itself seemed inadequate. He had come out the other side thinner and quieter, and slightly rearranged inside in ways he had never been able to fully map. He had been shot 4 times, stabbed twice, and left for dead once in the Sonoran Desert by a man he had trusted with his life. And still, somehow, this cage felt worse. Not because of the bars. Not because of the rocks children threw or the names people shouted or the indignity of performing his most basic human functions in public view. Not even because of the heat, which in the middle of a Redemption Creek afternoon was the kind of heat that didn't just sit on you but pressed down into you, searching for your center. It felt worse because he could see the hanging tree from here. It was a cottonwood, old and thick, on the north end of the main street. Someone had already tied the rope. It had been there since the second day, turning slowly in whatever breeze came through. It was the first thing he saw every morning and the last thing he saw before the dark got too complete to see anything. Cole Dantry was not afraid to die. He had made his peace with dying so many times that the peace had become a kind of practiced habit, like stretching before a long ride. What bothered him was dying for the wrong reason. Dying for things he hadn't done. Dying while the man who actually deserved to hang went on wearing clean suits and clean boots and sleeping in a fine bed above the bank. He knew the truth about Laredo. He knew it because he'd been there. Not as the man who pulled the trigger, as the man who walked in afterward, when the smoke had barely cleared, and found something that changed everything he thought he knew about why the West was the way it was. He'd found a letter. A set of papers, actually, tucked into the coat of one of the dead men. Financial papers. Names. Dates. A record of land transactions going back 8 years. Purchases made through violence disguised as commerce. A network of bench sheriffs and hired killers and lawyers who signed whatever they were paid to sign. Elton Marsh's name was at the top of every page. Cole had been working his way towards something with that information. Working carefully, trying to find someone with enough authority and enough integrity to actually act on it. That was how he'd been moving from town to town, not running from the law, but trying to find the right piece of the law that hadn't been bought yet. He had the papers hidden. Still had them. Even now. But he was in a cage, and the hanging tree was right there, turning in the breeze, and he was running out of time. So when the woman in the dark blue dress walked up to him in the early morning light and told him she needed to marry him, Cole Dantry did not immediately say no. He filed her away under unexpected variables, a category that had, over the years, saved his life more often than any skill he possessed. He asked her why. She told him. Not all of it at once, she was too careful for that, and he respected it. But she told him about her father. About the forged deed. About Elton Marsh's lawyer and Sheriff Pruitt's whiskey-loosened guilt, and the way the whole system in this town folded around Marsh like water around a stone. Smooth and accommodating and completely immovable. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Why marriage?" She said, "Because a wife can't be compelled to testify against her husband. And a husband can't be compelled to testify against his wife. If we're married, anything I know and anything you know becomes protected. It becomes leverage instead of just evidence." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "I've had 3 weeks," she said. "And nothing else to think about. What makes you think I know anything useful?" "Pruitt said you do." When he thought nobody was listening. "Pruitt," Cole said, and the word carried the weight of considerable experience with men like Pruitt. He stood up then, slowly, because his joints had been negotiating with the hard ground for 11 days and they hadn't come to a comfortable agreement. He walked to the bars and looked down at her. He was tall. She was not small, but he made her feel like she was standing at the bottom of something. "You know what happens to people who go up against Marsh," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "I buried one of them." Something in his face shifted. Not softened, that wasn't quite the right word. Something adjusted behind his eyes, like a weight being moved to a different position. He said, "The hanging is scheduled for 3 days from now." She said, "I know. You'd be marrying a dead man." "Not if we do this right," she said. And Cole Dantry, who had survived a mine shaft and a prison and 4 bullets and 1 knife and the desert, and the very specific category of betrayal that comes from people you trust, looked at this woman with her worn elbows and her cold burning anger, and decided that she might be the most dangerous person he'd encountered in a long time. "Tell me the rest of your plan," he said. She did. By the time she was done, Cole had 2 thoughts. The first was that the plan was either brilliant or suicidal, or possibly both simultaneously. The second was that he had nothing left to lose. He said yes. The Reverend Thomas Abel had presided over 63 marriages in his career, and he had never been asked to conduct one quite like this. He stood outside the cage on the afternoon of the 12th day with his Bible held against his chest and his expression arranged into what he hoped looked like dignified composure, though it kept sliding towards something closer to bewildered panic. Behind him, a crowd had gathered, not the rock-throwing afternoon crowd, but a more complicated assembly. Curious faces. Angry faces. A few people who seemed to be taking private bets. Sheriff Harlan Pruitt stood at the edge of the crowd looking like a man who had stepped in something unpleasant and couldn't figure out where to scrape his boot clean. Ada had handled the legal mechanics with a precision that surprised people who had written her off as a grieving woman acting out of grief. She had located, in the county records, the statute that permitted a prisoner awaiting trial to be married if both parties were consenting adults and a licensed minister was present and willing. She had also located, and this was the part that made Pruitt's jaw tighten, a supervision that entitled a spouse to 3 hours of private visitation with a prisoner within 24 hours of the ceremony. Private. No guards present. She had brought this documentation to Pruitt's office that morning with the air of someone who had already checked every exit. Pruitt had read the statute 3 times. Then he'd sent a rider to Marsh's house. The rider came back with a message: let it proceed. We'll deal with it after. That message terrified Ada more than a refusal would have. It meant Marsh wasn't worried. It meant Marsh thought he had something in place that made the marriage irrelevant. She filed that terror away under motivating information and went to find the Reverend. Abel had protested, quietly, in the way of a man who is afraid of everyone currently involved, and then he had agreed. In the way of a man who has decided that posterity will judge him better for having been present than absent. Now he stood outside the cage and read the words as quickly as dignity permitted. Cole Dantry stood on his side of the bars. Ada Voss stood on hers. They had agreed that the bars would remain between them for the ceremony itself. It was faster, and neither of them was interested in the performance of it. When the Reverend asked if Cole Dantry took this woman as his lawful wife, Cole said "I do" in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely unreadable. When the Reverend asked if Ada Voss took this man as her lawful husband, Ada said "I do," and her voice was also steady, but something underneath it was not. Something that she would not have named aloud and that Cole caught anyway because he was very good at hearing the things underneath words. Rings were not part of the arrangement. The Reverend pronounced them married under God and the law and stepped back like a man who has just lit a fuse and would like to be somewhere else when it goes off. The crowd made various sounds. Some of them were laughter. Some were anger. A few were something that might have been, in the right light, admiration. Pruitt walked up to Ada afterward and said quietly, "Mrs. Dantry, I want you to understand that whatever you think you're doing here, what I'm doing," Ada said, "is exercising my legal right to visit my husband. Tomorrow morning. 6 o'clock. Your deputy will unlock the cage and stand back 20 feet. The statute's clear on distance." Pruitt's mouth worked silently for a moment. Then he said, Marsh is going to what, Sheriff?" Ada said. "Say it out loud." "I'd love to hear it said out loud." Pruitt closed his mouth. Turned. Walked away. Ada went back to her wagon. She sat on the bench in the evening light and let herself shake for exactly 5 minutes, which was the amount of shaking she had allocated to this. And then she stopped and started going through the next part. Inside the cage, Cole sat back down in the dirt and thought about the papers. He had them wrapped in oilskin, tucked into the lining of his boot. 11 days in a cage and nobody had thought to check his boots, which said something about the quality of law enforcement in Redemption Creek. And also something about how comfortable people got when they thought they already had you. He needed to get those papers out of the cage and into the right hands before the hanging. But right hands was the complicated part. He had been trying to find right hands for 4 months and had so far found mostly wrong ones. Ada had mentioned, almost in passing, that she had a cousin who worked for a territorial newspaper 2 towns over. A man named Gideon Voss, who had a reputation, apparently, for publishing things that made powerful people uncomfortable. Cole turned that over in his mind. A newspaper. Not a court, not a lawman. Public record. Public pressure. The kind of thing that was harder to make disappear than a single piece of evidence in a sheriff's desk drawer. He thought about Ada standing outside his bars in her dark blue dress saying, "Not if we do this right." He thought about what she was risking. Her life, clearly. Whatever small remnant of security she had left. The wagon, the horse, the $30, the cold burning anger, all of it in play. He thought about the hanging tree, turning in the breeze. 3 days. He had 3 days, a woman he'd known for less than 48 hours, and papers that could burn Elton Marsh to the ground if they reached the right people in time. He also had something else. Something he hadn't told Ada yet. Something that changed the calculus significantly, that added a dimension to this situation that she didn't know to account for. One of the 3 dead marshals, the bounty charges that sat heaviest against Cole, had not been killed by Cole Dantry. He had been killed by one of Elton Marsh's men. Cole had the proof of that too. And the man who'd pulled that particular trigger was currently employed as a deputy in Redemption Creek. His name was Walt Seeger. And he ate breakfast every morning at the diner directly across from the cage. And he looked at Cole with the specific expression of a man who is hoping very hard that the other man will die before he can say anything. Cole had been watching Walt Seeger for 11 days. And tomorrow morning, Ada would be inside the cage. And they would have 3 hours, and a plan, and the kind of odds that Cole had faced before and survived. Usually. 6 o'clock came gray and still, the kind of morning that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it wanted to be. Ada arrived at the cage with a basket. The Reverend Abel had suggested she bring food, as a means of making the whole arrangement look domestically plausible. And she had taken the advice because it was the best cover available. Biscuits. Salt pork. A jar of coffee gone cold from the walk. Deputy Walt Seeger unlocked the cage door with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted to be very clear how much he hated this. He swung it open. Stepped back. Counted the 20 feet, and stood there with his hand near his hip and his face arranged into something between contempt and nervousness. Ada stepped inside. The door swung closed behind her, not locked, the statute didn't permit locking, and she was inside the cage with Cole Dantry for the first time. With the bars around them and the whole quiet street outside and Walt Seeger 20 feet away watching everything. They sat across from each other in the dirt. Ada unpacked the basket like a woman visiting her husband, which she technically was, because the law said so. Which was still strange enough to send a ripple of disorientation through her each time she remembered it. Cole took a biscuit. Ate it. Said, barely moving his lips. "Seeger's watching." "I know. Don't look at him." She didn't. She poured the cold coffee into the 2 cups she'd brought, and handed him one, and they looked at each other across the dirt floor of the cage, and talked like people who had known each other longer than they had. Because that was what the moment required. "The papers are in my left boot," Cole said. Same almost still lips. The voice barely above the wind. "Wrapped in oilskin. I need you to take them when you leave." "How?" "Roll them along the inside of your left arm when you put your coat on. It'll hold them against your forearm until you're clear." Ada nodded slightly. "The newspaper?" "Gideon. I can have a rider to him by noon." "There's something else," Cole said. She looked at him. His eyes were doing the storm before the storm thing again. "Seeger killed one of the marshals," he said. "The one in Cimarron. The one they're pinning hardest on me." Ada was very still. "Can you prove it?" "In the papers. There's a payment record. Date matches the Cimarron killing. Marsh paid Seeger $300 3 days after. That's circumstantial. There's also a letter," Cole said, "from Marsh to one of his other men. It mentions Cimarron and mentions cleanup." and mentioned Seeger by name. Ada sat with that for a moment. Outside the cage, Walt Seeger shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The morning was warming up already. By noon it would be the kind of heat that turned dust into a living thing. If Seeger knows we have that, Ada said, then Seeger becomes a problem faster than Marsh does. Is he already a problem? Marsh sent a message yesterday, Cole said. Through the boy who brings water. The message said be patient. To Seeger? To Seeger. Ada thought about what be patient meant from Elton Marsh to the man guarding a prisoner scheduled to hang in 2 days. She thought about all the things that could happen to a prisoner between now and a hanging that could be documented as accident, or escape attempt, or sudden illness. They're going to move the hanging up, she said. Or move the manner of it, Cole said. A hanging is public. It requires an audience. There are other ways. They looked at each other. Tonight, Ada said. It has to be tonight. My thoughts exactly. You have a plan for the physical part? I've been watching this cage for 11 days, Cole said. The lock is a standard padlock. Yale pattern, not complicated. The weak point isn't the lock, it's the hinge on the left side door bar. The bolt is worn. If you apply force at the right angle, I can't get you a tool in here, Ada said. Seeger will search the basket. You already got me a tool, Cole said. She frowned. He glanced down at the cup she'd brought the coffee in. It was tin. Old tin. The handle had a seam where 2 pieces were joined. The seam, he said. About 1.5 inches long and thin enough. If I work it against the hinge, it'll take hours. I have until 3 in the morning before Seeger's watch ends and Morrison starts. Morrison's younger and pays more attention. Seeger falls asleep. Ada looked at the cup. Then at Cole. Then at the cup again. She thought about her father in the ground and the forged deed and the tin box that was empty now and Elton Marsh in his clean suit sleeping in his fine bed. Gideon needs to receive the papers before you're out, she said. He needs to already have them. So even if something goes wrong, even if I don't make it, Cole said. It wasn't self-pity. It was just accurate. Yes, Ada said. Even then. Cole nodded. He reached down and pulled off his left boot, worked at the inner lining with fingers that were more dexterous than their rough exterior suggested, and produced a roll of oilskin wrapped tight enough to have survived 11 days of heat and dirt with remarkable composure. Ada put her coat on. She took the papers and pressed them against the inside of her forearm and felt the edges of a dozen documents that had ruined and would ruin lives pressed against her skin like a brand. One more thing, Cole said, as she adjusted the coat. What? When you get to Gideon, tell him to publish everything. Every name. Don't hold any of it back for leverage. Don't use it as a bargaining chip. Publish all of it at once. Why? Cole looked at her. Because Marsh has survived for 8 years because people held things back. Thinking they could use it. Thinking partial exposure was safer. But you can't half-kill a man like Marsh. You have to burn it all at once. Ada held his gaze. Like a prairie fire, she said. Exactly like that. She stood up. She took the basket. She walked to the cage door and pushed it open and stepped out into the warming morning. Walt Seeger was already walking toward her. The rider left for Gideon Voss at 10 minutes past 7 in the morning, with the oilskin-wrapped papers tucked under his shirt, and enough money to make him ride fast and not ask questions. Ada had used nearly her entire remaining $30. She had 11 cents left. She was not afraid of poverty the way some people were afraid of it. She was afraid of failing. Those were different fears, and the second one was the one that followed her through the afternoon and into the evening as she sat in her wagon and watched the cage from a distance and waited. The day passed the way days pass when something is coming, slowly, the hours dragging themselves across the heat, the sun taking a particular interest in making everything below it uncomfortable. The town went about its business with the specific forced normalcy of a community that knows something is happening but has collectively agreed to look away. Elton Marsh emerged from the bank at 2 in the afternoon and walked across the street to speak to Sheriff Pruitt. Ada watched them from the shadow of her wagon canopy. The conversation was short. Marsh did most of the talking. Pruitt did most of the nodding. When they separated, Pruitt walked directly to the jail and Ada heard, faintly across the still afternoon, the sounds of something being rearranged. At 4 o'clock, Deputy Walt Seeger was joined at the cage by a second man, not a regular deputy. A man Ada didn't recognize. Large. Watchful. The kind of large and watchful that didn't come from civic duty. Her stomach dropped. They were moving the timetable. Marsh had decided not to wait for the public hanging. Tonight, or close to it, something was going to happen to Cold Dan Try inside that cage that would be called something else in the morning. She had to warn him. But there was no way to get to him. Seeger and the new man were both alert, both watching, and she had already used her one legal visit. She thought about it for exactly 10 minutes, which was all the time she had. Then she did something that she knew was reckless and necessary and possibly the wrong thing, except that it was also the only thing available. She walked into the saloon. The Dusty Crown was the kind of establishment that existed in the philosophical space between civilization and its absence. It smelled like spilled whiskey and old wood and the accumulated regrets of everyone who had ever sat in it. Ada walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey she didn't intend to drink and positioned herself 3 feet from where Pruitt was sitting with his third of the evening. She said conversationally, to the bartender, and to the air and to anyone who might be listening. Funny thing about the territorial newspaper. My cousin Gideon writes for them. He's going to run a story tomorrow morning about land fraud and about 3 murdered marshals and about who actually killed the one in Cimarron. The saloon was not quiet. It was loud enough that her voice didn't carry far. But it carried to Pruitt. She saw his hand freeze around his glass. She picked up her untouched whiskey, left a coin on the bar, and walked out. She was back in her wagon inside 5 minutes. She sat in the dark and breathed deliberately, and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was Pruitt walking quickly out of the saloon and across the street, not toward the cage but toward Marsh's bank. He went in through the side door. He was inside for 20 minutes. When he came out, he walked toward the cage. He spoke briefly to Seeger. The new large man received some instruction and then left, walking toward the stable at the far end of town. Ada exhaled very slowly. Not stopped. Not fixed. But disrupted. Pruitt was scared, and a scared Pruitt was a differently dangerous Pruitt, a Pruitt who might do something unpredictable. But at least not a Pruitt executing Marsh's original plan with quiet efficiency. She needed one more thing. The Reverend Abel lived in the small house attached to the church on the south end of the main street. Ada found him reading by candlelight and apologized for the hour, and explained that she needed his help, not his blessing. And that if he had been honest with himself on the day he agreed to perform that ceremony, he'd known the honesty part was coming. Abel listened. He was a small man with large ears and eyes that were smarter than his general air of anxious accommodation suggested. He had come to Redemption Creek 10 years ago with genuine ideals and had spent the decades since watching them erode under the specific pressures of a community controlled by a man like Marsh. He said, "What do you need me to do?" Ada told him. He went pale. Then he said yes. At 2 in the morning, when the main street was as close to empty as it ever got, and the stars were the hard bright stars of a cloudless desert night, the Reverend Thomas Abel walked to the cage and requested a moment of spiritual counsel with the condemned man. It was his legal and ecclesiastical right, and even Seeger, half asleep and resentful, couldn't deny it without generating a complication he didn't want to explain to Pruitt. Abel was inside the cage for 8 minutes. When he came out, he carried something small in his coat pocket that hadn't been in his coat pocket before. At 3 in the morning, when Seeger's watch ended and Morrison's began, young Morrison, Attentive Morrison, Cole Dantry put a bent piece of tin into the hinge bolt of the cage door, and was not there when Morrison arrived. He was gone into the dark. And so was Ada. And so, before morning, was their last chance to make any of this matter. They met at the creek bed east of town, the place Ada had named when she'd relayed instructions through Reverend Abel's impromptu pastoral visit. The creek was dry this time of year, just pale stones and cracked clay and the ghost of water, and the cottonwoods along its bank threw moon shadows that were almost but not quite darkness. Cole arrived first, moving the way he moved, quiet, deliberate, no wasted motion. He was wearing his coat, which Abel had also conveyed during the spiritual council portion of the visit, along with the other thing Ada had sent, his guns. They were back where they belonged, holstered on his hips. He didn't feel transformed by them. He was not a man who required weapons to feel complete. But he felt less like a display in a freak show, which was something. Ada arrived 4 minutes later, leading her horse. She looked at him standing there in the moon shadow, and something in her face did a complicated thing that she resolved quickly into focus. "Gideon should have the papers by now," she said. "It's 40 miles. Ryder left at 7. If he pushed. He's a good horse. Then we have until Marsh reads the morning paper," Cole said, "before everything changes. Or until Morrison notices the empty cage," Ada said. "That happens first." They looked at each other in the dark and the creekbed silence. There was a piece of this that Ada had been turning over for the past 12 hours, something that she'd been avoiding the direct shape of but that had found her anyway. The way uncomfortable truths do. She said it now because the dark made it easier, and the time was nearly past for holding anything back. "Laredo," she said. "I need to know." Cole didn't move. "The ranch. The 7 men. I need to know what happened, and I need to know it before we go any further." A long silence. The dry creek stones settled minutely in the dark. Cole said, "I was there." "I won't tell you I wasn't." "Did you?" "No," he said. "But I was there too late. I came in after. I thought I was going in ahead of it. I had information that Marsh's men were moving on that ranch. I was trying to get there first, to warn them." He paused. "I didn't get there first." 7 men, Ada said. 7 men, Cole agreed, and the 2 words carried everything he'd been carrying for 4 months. "I found them. I found the papers on the man I told you about. And I knew that if I went to the law was already bought. So I ran. With the papers. Trying to find somewhere to take them." Another pause. "That's when the bounty went up. Marsh needed a story for Laredo, and I was the most convenient story available." Ada was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I believe you. You don't have to." "I know," she said. "I do anyway." The decision in her voice was the same quality as when she'd walked up to the cage, not performed certainty, but the real thing. The kind that has been tested by doubt, and arrived at anyway. Cole nodded once, and something in his posture shifted in a way that was very small and very significant. They had to move. They both knew it. But before they did, hoofbeats, multiple, coming fast from the direction of town. Ada's horse startled. Cole put a hand on the animal's neck and looked toward the sound. "Morrison," Ada said. "Or Marsh didn't wait for the paper." They mounted. The horse was her father's horse, a gray quarter horse named Bell, and Bell had been reliable through worse nights than this. Cole rode behind Ada, and they went east along the creek bed because the soft clay muffled sound better than the road. The hoofbeats swelled behind them and then, confusingly, split, some continuing east on the main road, some cutting south. Pruitt was organizing. Covering angles. Cole said into her ear, "There's a way to end this tonight." "What way?" "Marsh himself." Not kill him. He felt her tighten, not in relief, but in something more complicated. But get him on record. He has a telegraph in his office. He's going to be sending messages in the next hour trying to suppress the story, trying to reach people above Gideon's level. If we can get into that office before he finishes, he'll have men. He'll have two. The large one who went to the stable went back. And his personal man, who sleeps above the bank. You counted. I spent 11 days counting. Ada turned Belle in a wide arc, cutting through the cottonwoods toward town from the south. The direction no one was currently covering because all the searching was going east. They came into the south end of Redemption Creek at a walk. Past the church where Reverend Abel was almost certainly awake and praying. Past the jail, dark now and empty. Down the alley that ran parallel to the main street, where the buildings threw shadows wide enough to ride through. The bank was brick. Marsh's office was on the ground floor, behind the vault room. Light was already showing in the window. Cole slid off Belle. Ada stayed mounted. She would need to be ready to move fast and from a height. He went in through the back. What happened in the next 7 minutes Cole would describe later only in the broadest terms, which was sufficient, because what mattered was the outcome. Marsh's large man was in the front of the bank, watching the main street. Marsh's personal man was indeed above, asleep or close enough to it that the distinction proved academic. Marsh himself was at his desk, already composing a telegraph message. He looked up when Cole came through the office door. Elton Marsh was 61 years old and had spent 40 of those years accumulating what he thought of as power, and what was, when you reduced it to its elements, simply fear. Other people's fear. Carefully cultivated, kept well watered, harvested regularly. He looked at Cole Dantry and he felt his own, for possibly the first time in decades. "You're dead," Marsh said. "Not yet," Cole said. "And you're going to finish that telegraph message." "Just not the one you were writing." What Marsh wrote, at gunpoint, over the next 6 minutes, was a detailed account, abbreviated and self-incriminating in ways that would have taken a lawyer years to construct, that corroborated the essential facts contained in the oilskin papers. Land fraud. Hired violence. The names of dead marshals and who had actually arranged their deaths. He signed it. Cole made him send it. Not to one recipient, to 4, the Territorial Governor's Office, the Federal Marshal's Office in Santa Fe, the Associated Press Wire, and Gideon Voss at the Territorial Courier. When it was done, Marsh sat back and looked at the man across from him with an expression that was trying to be contempt, and not quite managing it. "You think a telegraph is going to hold up in court?" he said. "You think they won't say it was signed under duress?" "The papers will hold up," Cole said. "The telegraph just makes sure someone reads them." He left Marsh in his chair and walked out the back. He walked out to where Ada was waiting with Belle, and the street around them was beginning to show the first gray of a coming dawn, not committed yet, just testing the idea of light. "Done?" she said. "Done." They heard horses from the east end of the street. Pruitt and his men coming back. And from the front of the bank, the sound of a man who had been sitting very quietly during the whole proceeding deciding that now was the time to stop being quiet. They rode. By the time the sun was fully up over Redemption Creek, the telegraph had reached Santa Fe. By the following morning, the Territorial Courier had run the story on its front page under the headline that Gideon Voss would later call the most important 12 words of his career. Land Fraud Empire Exposed, 8 years, 12 counties, 1 man's name. Elton Marsh was arrested on the 3rd day. He did not go quietly, but he went. Sheriff Harlan Pruitt, to his very limited credit, was the one who put the cuffs on. Whether this was conscience or survival instinct or some mixture of both was a question that Redemption Creek would debate for years. The same way communities debate the motives of men who make the right decision for the wrong reasons. Walt Seeger ran. He was caught in New Mexico Territory 6 weeks later by a federal marshal who had read the papers carefully and knew exactly where to look. The Double V Ranch deed, the real one, Thomas Voss's original, was found in Marsh's files. It took 6 months in a territorial court proceeding and a lawyer Ada couldn't really afford, but it was found, and the fraudulent sale was voided. And the land went back to the name on the original deed. Voss. The ranch was damaged. Worse than damaged. The main house had been used for storage by Marsh's men, and the bunkhouse had partially collapsed in a spring storm, and the cattle were gone. All 400 of them dispersed or sold. But the land was hers. She stood in the yard on the morning she got the title back, alone, and looked at what was left of the porch. The sagging boards. The cracked window glass. The smell of the place, which was smoke and dust and something older underneath, the mineral smell of specific earth that she had known since before she had words for knowing. She thought about her father. She thought about 11 days of sitting still in a cage. She thought about what it cost a person to stay that still when everything around them was chaos and contempt, and she thought it was probably the hardest thing she'd ever witnessed. And she'd witnessed some hard things. Cole Dantry had not stayed. He had left Redemption Creek on the morning after Marsh's arrest. When the federal marshals arrived and the situation became something that required his formal presence, and his testimony, and his truth told clearly and on record. He had given all of that. He had told the truth about Laredo, about the papers, about all of it, in a voice that didn't shake and in words that were precise and without decoration. The charges against him were reviewed and were not, in the end, what anyone had said they were. There was still a tangle. There were things in Cole Dantry's past that were genuinely complicated. And the West was not in the habit of forgiving complicated, but the Laredo massacre was not among them. Not his. After the testimony, he had come to find Ada. Not at the ranch, at the wagon, which she'd been living in since before all of it started, still parked at the edge of town while the legalities resolved. He had stood by the wagon and said, "They're letting me go." She'd said, "Good. I'm leaving." "I know." A silence. The kind that has shape. He said, "The marriage was legal and will need to be legally dissolved." Ada said, "My cousin Gideon knows a lawyer in the territory who owes him a favor. It won't take long." Cole nodded. He looked at her for a moment with those storm before the storm eyes. "Ada," he said. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. "We both know what it was." It was what it needed to be. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he said, "Your father would have liked what you did." She looked away at the middle distance for a moment, at the edge where the flat country met the beginning of the sky. "He would have done it himself," she said. "If he'd had time." Cole Dantry left Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning with the sun behind him, and the road west ahead of him, and no bounty on his head for the first time in 4 months. Whether he was at peace with the things he carried was a question he kept for himself. Men like Cole Dantry generally do. The hanging tree was still there, at the north end of the main street. The rope had been taken down. Someone had cut it the morning after Marsh's arrest, and nobody had asked who. The tree remained. Trees like that always do. They have no opinion about what's been done beneath them. They just grow. Ada rebuilt the double V herself, mostly. With help from the Reverend Abel, who turned out to have more practical skills than his vocation suggested. And from a few neighbors who came around once it was clear the air in that county had changed permanently. It took 2 years. The porch didn't sag anymore. She never remarried. Whether that was grief or independence or the specific difficulty of having, even briefly, measured one standard against all others and found the comparison inconvenient, she didn't say. People who asked got a look that discouraged follow-up questions. On the first anniversary of her father's death, she put flowers on his grave and stood there in the evening light and said what she needed to say to the person who deserved to hear it, in the quiet, private way of people who know that some conversations transcend the boundaries that death tries to impose on them. On the way back to the ranch, she passed the cage. It was still there. Nobody had moved it. It sat in the main street on its flatbed wagon, empty now, its iron bars catching the last of the sunset, and making shadows across the road that were bars and then not bars as the light shifted. She stopped and looked at it for a long time. Then she kept walking. Some cages, she had learned, are physical things. Iron and bolt and hinge. You can work at those with a piece of tin and patience, and the right angle of force. And some cages are made of fear. Of silence. Of the habit of looking away. Those are the ones that take longer. But they open too, she had found. They open too. The horse her father had given her was named Belle, and Belle lived to be 23 years old, which is very old for a horse, and was buried on the east edge of the W property under a cottonwood tree that Ada planted herself the summer after everything that came before. Nobody ever put a rope on that tree.